My name is Sarah Deer. I'm a professor of law, and I am a citizen of the Muscogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. I have worked on sexual assault since I was 20 years old, and I am involved in a lot of national projects to help address sexual assault in Indian country. So the typical SART that I'm familiar with would include someone from law enforcement, someone from the local hospital, a nurse, perhaps a trained nurse, the prosecutor's office, as well as victim advocacy. That's really the core of a SART. In terms of non-traditional folks being involved in a SART, I have seen medicine men, medicine women join a SART for a tribal community. I've seen defense attorneys serve on SARTs. So it's really about the community and what that community offers, because it's going to be different depending on who works on sexual assault in that particular community. One of the things that's really important when you're doing work in Indian country, for example, is to make sure that there are people involved in the SART that are culturally connected to that community. So if you have a spiritual leader, somebody who may provide services or care to a victim, having them involved in the SART means that there's going to be more likelihood that that survivor will be connected with that cultural knowledge to help her through the next weeks or months to come in the aftermath of a sexual assault. One example that I can think of is that a lot of survivors of sexual assault who are Native want to smudge light sage, which is a cleansing ceremony that could be very appropriate in the aftermath of trauma. And a lot of times our hospitals aren't really set up to allow something like that to occur. So when we have traditional people involved in a SART, they can communicate the needs of survivors from that community. And I've worked, for example, in a hospital that was able to, just for a few minutes, turn off the smoke detectors. Sometimes the fire marshals don't like that, but it allows that survivor to engage in that ceremonial experience right there in the hospital. So that communication between the traditional leaders and the hospital staff or the fire marshal can sometimes create these avenues for modification of a traditional SART to meet the needs of that particular community. As an example, in a tribal community, say you have a spiritual leader who is involved in the SART in order to provide those services to a victim in that community. Sometimes they need specialized training. Just the fact that they're a spiritual leader doesn't necessarily mean they have the knowledge about what happens in the aftermath of sexual assault. And so what that kind of training might do is then provide that traditional leader with more knowledge that can do outreach into the community. They're ready, even if a case doesn't come into the system per se, that traditional leader, traditional spiritual healer person could engage with survivors outside the scope of the SART itself, and that can only benefit the community in the long run. I think an underserved population can mean a lot of different things, but primarily what we're looking at is folks who are part of marginalized communities. So that could include race, it could include class, it could include an ethnic or immigration status, a community that isn't normally empowered to make change in the community, but whose members may be actually more at risk for something like sexual assault. One of the biggest challenges in making sure a SART is accessible to a marginalized community would be the trust issue. Systems have historically oppressed underserved communities. So when you involve law enforcement and prosecutors, there may be a lot of nervousness around a survivor engaging with those professions if they have been part of historical oppression, even if that particular law enforcement officer does great work with underserved communities. Being a representative of that particular profession could present some barriers. In order to build trust, I think you have to back up and lower the expectations on how quickly things could change. For example, in tribal communities, that kind of distrust has been ongoing for centuries, really, if we're honest about it. And so to expect the SART to be able to say within a year of its formation to be able to address that level of distrust would be, I think, unreasonable. But some of the things that can be done are to do outreach into the community. Find out who in that community is sort of part of the response to sexual assault, maybe in an informal way. Bring them in as experts as you set up the SART, and make sure those folks are compensated. Sometimes people do outreach, expect expertise to come back, and that needs to be rewarded or compensated at a rate that would be commensurate with any other expert. I think that a SART, the development of a SART needs to really center the most marginalized people in the community. If you can address and conquer, right, the needs and the concerns of the most marginalized communities, I think you'll go a long way to addressing the needs in the community as a whole. So it's really about centering those marginalized communities and saying, let's start with the folks that are most at risk and least likely to call for assistance in the aftermath of a sexual assault. Don't wait and do that as an extra piece. Actually make that part of the central focus of a SART. And one way that you might be able to do that is by identifying particular leaders in the community who may be able to put you in touch with, for example, in a tribal community, somebody who is identified as a spiritual healer or spiritual leader. If you don't know who those folks are, again, give yourself the time to develop those relationships. Don't expect that one phone call will sort of solve the problem. It might take extended and repeated outreach in order to bring those folks into the community, bring them into the SART fold, as it were, and begin work to do that outreach. Well, one example would be in Indian country where a woman coming forward or a teen coming forward in the aftermath of a sexual assault is doing that in the context of their entire life experience. And that life experience almost always is going to include awareness about sexual assault of another female family member or friends. It's so common in Indian country to be a victim of sexual assault that someone coming forward might be bringing sort of the baggage that their other women in their lives have experienced. And so it's not just about that night, that sexual assault. It's about the larger community. And I may be nervous about engaging with law enforcement because my mother or my auntie didn't have a good experience. So if that SART can create a cohesive safety net for that survivor, it might actually end up improving the lives of the women in her life who have experienced sexual assault but did not come forward. So it's not just about what happens in that moment, but also what happens for that survivor in the larger context of her community, her family, and her friends. Certainly in marginalized communities, there's been a history of perhaps over-policing or over-incarceration, and a survivor coming forward might be seen as sort of betraying her community. And that's why you have to have, from the very get-go, you have to have members of that local community with standing to be connected within that SART. Because if it's all outsiders, if there's, for example, no tribal membership in the SART, it's more likely that we will have what we call that closing of the ranks and disengagement, and perhaps even blaming the victim in some cases. And that's not to say that that's a tribal belief system to blame a victim, but within the context of engaging with law enforcement and prosecutors, there might be a distrust there that is palpable and must be addressed from the get-go. But if it happens, if that closing of ranks happens in the immediate aftermath of a sexual assault, it's really too late. And that's why, in order to provide the best services to victims, those community members need to be part long before there's actually an exam and a police report. In order to do outreach to Native communities and Native survivors of sexual assault, there needs to be a very clear understanding of the history of that particular community. For example, was this community relocated or removed from their original inhabitant, original sort of place on the planet? The reason something like that would be really important is because traditionally tribal spiritual beliefs are connected to the land. And for survivors of sexual assault, it might be really important to engage in those healing methodologies. But if that tribe has been removed from their original location, those sacred sites, those spiritual sites, might not be accessible to survivors. So it's really important to know those kinds of things, know the history of the tribe, and dating back literally centuries is appropriate. Understanding the structure of that tribal government, understanding whether or not that tribe actually prosecutes crimes like sexual abuse and sexual assault. You really have to get to know the tribal government structure. Even though you think, well, we're not going to be engaging with the tribal council treasurer, for example, it's still really important to understand that government structure. And not just for that survivor, but for the long-term understanding how that community has traditionally experienced the outside community. Say if you had, for example, a county SART that had a neighboring tribe, it's really critical that that SART have training and understanding about the history of that tribe, the structure of its government, and spiritual and religious beliefs that might be affiliated with that particular community. One of the most complicated areas of American law, considering all the various issues that American law might encompass, is the question of jurisdiction in the aftermath of a crime that's committed against a Native person. The history of the legal system that affects tribes is extraordinarily complicated, and it differs depending on which tribe you're talking about. So even if you're in the same state, the rules that apply to one tribe might not apply to the other. And this can be really critical for questions of who can actually prosecute a crime, a tribal prosecutor, a state prosecutor, or a federal prosecutor. So as the SART begins its work to identify who's going to do what when, there needs to be a clear understanding of jurisdiction, who's involved, who has the authority, is it shared with another government? Because again, those things can't happen on the fly when you have a crisis situation and you have a survivor who's in need of services. So that question of authority needs to be mapped out as clear as possible through the documents that the SART creates. In a tribal community, a SART could be set up just to be available in the context of a sexual assault that occurs on the Indian reservation that's affiliated with that tribe. And again, you would have a lot of the same players that you would have in what we might call a mainstream SART. So you'd want a tribal prosecutor, a tribal law enforcement officer, and somebody from the local Indian Health Service or other health providing entity. So in some ways it looks very similar in terms of the structure of it. But there's going to be more complications due to jurisdictional questions. There may be a need to have traditional spiritual leaders as part of that SART. And the tribe itself might have unique issues and needs and bring in another player to that team. One of the things that could be really important there is a clear coordination between the tribal SART and the local neighboring SART. They can be separate, but the memorandums of understanding and the kinds of communication that happens can be really important. One example would be a survivor who is not entirely sure where the crime occurred. And this can happen if a victim is drugged or is using alcohol and there's memory issues. It's going to matter where that crime happened. Maybe part of the crime occurred on the reservation and part of the crime occurred off the reservation. And so if you are not working closely with your neighboring SART, big pieces of the puzzle might not come to fruition, in which case it becomes really difficult for the prosecutor. You know, there's a lot of people who think that working with sexual assault must be incredibly depressing and traumatizing. And I don't want to in any way minimize that as part of the work that we do. But in my experience, working with survivors of sexual assault can actually be incredibly inspiring, right? You're having the honor of being part of someone's life, perhaps on the worst day of their life. And to be invited into that intimate sort of experience is an honor. And then from there on out, you might be able to be part of that person's life as they rebuild it and enjoy their life again and laugh and have exciting things happen. And you're invited to be part of that and to be a partner in that. And for that reason, I find the work to be not depressing, but actually very inspiring and very fulfilling. It doesn't always have to be sad news. I mean, certainly sexual assault is trauma. We don't want to, again, minimize that, but the privilege of being part of a community that's trying to do the right thing is empowering and very inspiring at the same time.